Just to kind of recap where we are, there are certain OSHA regulations that appear from time to time that affect multiple industries, and the silica rule is an example of one of these. Currently, there are certain organizations who are making the appropriate posturing, maneuvering, I guess planning, whatever they want to call it. They're trying to get themselves organized in to be able to contest the rule for various reasons. But at the moment, the silica rule is the silica rule. I've just taken a selection of images on the first frame here. Silica dust is not just dust, and silica dust that will take your breath away. All of this awareness that's come in to the construction industry in recent months. And OSHA, for the first 30 days of the implementation of the silica rule, we're basically in a consultation period with contractors, general contractors, masons, anyone who had an interest in controlling silica dust. And it was designed to help them to comply with the rules, with the silica rule. And so what we had to do as an industry, or a number of industries, was to understand what's involved in the silica rule and understand what's in it for us in terms of what we have to do, what's our responsibility. Some of it's simple, some of it's not. The more that we can make it simple, I think it's probably obvious that we will have a better opportunity to control the generation of silica dust. And some of the verbiage that's coming out of the documentation, to better protect workers exposed to respirable crystalline silica, OSHA has introduced two new silica standards, one for construction and the other one for general industry. OSHA will begin enforcing most provisions of the standard for construction on September 23, 2017, and will begin enforcing most provisions of the standard for general industry and maritime on June 23, 2018. Workers who inhale these very small crystalline silica particles are at increased risk of developing serious silica-related diseases, including silicosis, an incurable lung disease that can lead to disability and death. If any of you have minors in your family from generations gone past, this was something obviously that affected them. Lung cancer, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, COPD, and kidney disease. So there's been a lot of information in a short period of time to try and explain to the construction industry and to general and maritime industries what damage silica dust ingestion can do, crystallized silica. And so OSHA wanted to produce advice on how to comply. One of the things I would normally do, and I did it on this occasion, is that when I see something from OSHA, I do have the ability to pick up the phone and speak to some pretty senior people in OSHA to try and get an idea from them as to how it may affect a particular industry or a particular group of industries. And I got some information from them, some help from them. I'm not sure that it was helpful in the way that I thought it would be, but then that's probably true of a lot of the stuff that OSHA produces. As with much of the construction industry, there is an emphasis on the qualified person. Okay? So first of all, the employer has a responsibility to identify silica-present work practices, and there are courses available for that. They have to quantify the crystallized silica content or exposure present in the work practice. They have to formulate an abatement plan to reduce exposure to acceptable levels. They have to introduce equipment / training / any other abatement methods identified. And I think it's clear from the previous 4 bullet points that employers need assistance with these requirements. If I asked in the room for anyone to raise their hand if they feel qualified to handle the information in bullet points 1 through 4 at the moment, we're not going to see many, if any, hands. It's very specialized. It's something that's new. It's certainly something that's new to us in our realm of the construction industry, but it's the law, and we have to do something about it. So what does the standard require? Well, the standard 1926-1153 requires employers to limit worker exposure to respirable crystallized or crystalline silica and take other steps to protect workers. Employers can either use a control method laid out in something called Table 1 of the construction standard, or they can measure workers' exposure to silica and independently decide which dust controls work best to limit exposure in their workplace to the permissible exposure limit, or PEL as it's called. It would be really nice if we could all follow Table 1, because it sounds a lot easier than trying to do what comes after Table 1 in this sentence. How you're going to measure a worker's exposure to crystallized silica intake or ingestion when they're working on a job site and you somehow have to figure out how many milligrams per cubic litre of air that they are potentially being exposed to of crystallized silica is a challenge in itself, and it's almost an impossible challenge. I got involved in this in Scotland maybe 25 years ago when they were doing some demolition work on 35-storey apartment blocks that had been built in the 50s, and they had used blue asbestos as a fire retardant material. Based on the blue asbestos content, which was a great cause of cancer, they decided that they needed to quantify the level of blue asbestos dust that was going to be coming down in the demolition process, and they couldn't quantify it. In fact, they couldn't quantify it to the point where those tower blocks were only demolished about 7 years ago because of the difficulties involved in identifying the levels of blue asbestos in a measurable kind of quantity of air. So it's a supremely difficult thing to do, especially in a construction environment. You can imagine it might be somewhat easier in an industrial environment within a premises, within a closed environment. There may well be calculations that you can make. We don't normally have that luxury. So what does Table 1 say? Well, Table 1 says, and this is a classic example of where OSHA does help us here. The equipment and the task, handheld and stand-mounted drills, including impact and rotary hammer drills, would be the equipment being used. Use drill equipped with commercially available shroud or cooling with dust collection system. Operate and maintain tool in accordance with manufacturer's instructions to minimize dust emissions. Dust collector must provide the airflow recommended by the tool manufacturer or greater and have a filter with 99% or greater efficiency and a filter cleaning mechanism. Use a HEPA filtered vacuum when cleaning the holes. The most important part of this table right now is when you look up in this column here. Required respiratory protection and minimum assigned protection factor. Less than a 4-hour shift? None. More than a 4-hour shift? None. So what we're really saying is, and this is what we get involved in our industry, we are involved in the infrequent drilling of holes for the erecting of mast climbers or scaffold. We're not doing it every minute of every day. We're normally doing it with a drill bit that places us, and a drilling machine that places us some distance away from the holes that we're going to be drilling. There are various factors that can come into all of that. But OSHA has said within Table 1, if we are working with handheld and stand-mounted drills, including impact and rotary hammer drills, here's what we have to do to control it. But really the important part at the moment is that if we do, they're saying there's no real requirement for any kind of face respirator, okay? Which takes you away from the world of fit testing and all of what's included there. Yes, sir?
We've got all this stuff. The worry that I have is I've got a vacuum cleaner now that's now full of that.
Sure.
And I got to go throw it in the dumpster.
Of course.
So
You have to control it.
So how do you control it?
Yeah, and that's the point. This is where my questions to OSHA came at this point. At the moment, and the question really, and it's a valid question, We have a HEPA vacuum that's full. We need to empty it. How do we control the dust in the emptying process? How do we protect the person who's doing the emptying in the process? The other example I would give to you is when masons are working on scaffolding and they're bringing the scaffold plank off the scaffold. What's the first thing they do when they're bringing the scaffold plank down? They turn it on its side and they bang it on the scaffold and all the dust falls to the ground. Yeah? So these are, as well as your vacuuming example, these are examples of where there might not be the same level of control in that instance. So you've got to do two things at that point. According to the calls that I made to OSHA, you've got to do two things, which I'm going to come to in the next couple of slides. You can go into this alternative measure exposure control system. Employers who do not fully implement the control methods on Table 1, and this may be an example of where that doesn't occur, you need to determine the amount of silica that the workers are exposed to, if it is, or may be reasonably expected to be, or above the action level of 25 micrograms per silica per cubic meter of air. Impossible, right? It's almost impossible to measure. Averaged over an 8-hour day, and protect workers from the respirable crystalline silica exposure above the permitted exposure limit, etc., etc. All of this language kind of tells us what we need to do, but it doesn't tell us what we need to do. Okay? That's really the problem that we have. First of all, when it comes to the drilling of the holes, let's just deal with that for a minute. As well as the Table 1 that OSHA produced, they also produced an information leaflet that contains within it a couple of photographs where OSHA would deem that for this type of operation that we are involved in, this is the acceptable type of equipment that we should be using. These are photographs from the OSHA information sheet. And as you can imagine, the manufacturers of this type of equipment, rotary drills, etc., came up with a very effective dust collection system or vacuuming system as soon as the silica standard was produced. Okay? So we have, in our daily operation in the erecting, dismantling of scaffolds and mast climbers and transport platforms, we have equipment out there in the marketplace that's fully compliant as far as OSHA is concerned. They've given us pictures to show us what we need to do and what we need to use, which is actually pretty helpful because they don't normally do that kind of thing. It's very useful, and honestly, the cost of this type of equipment is really not prohibitive for the benefit that we get from it. In other words, we have a method of protection that we don't really have to worry about as long as our work method is consistent. In other words, infrequent drilling of holes into a structure. What else does the standard require at that point? Well, before we get to that, let's deal with the question that I asked and then the question that came from the floor. And they were kind of two in the same question. The question was, what if I use a HEPA vacuum cleaner that meets the wording of the standard, and it's full and I have to empty it? And the same question, or a similar question that I posed to OSHA when I made the phone call was, what if I'm taking plank from a scaffold and turning the boards up on their end and banging them on the scaffold and letting all of that stuff fall to the ground uncontrolled? The answer I got was twofold. First of all, this is answer one. Okay? You've got to quantify, you've got to control, which is almost, as I say, impossible in a construction environment. The second piece of advice that I got from a senior member of the OSHA team up in Washington, D.C., was that the management of the dust control through the use of water is something that they see as very important moving forward. So, for instance, when you have plank and scaffold, and there is a high dust element, which probably is some kind of crystallized silica element within it, really what the suggestion was, almost verbatim that came from OSHA to me, was you need to soak it before you clean it. In other words, you need to get rid of it. Now throws up a million questions in my mind, right? When you created it in the first place, how did it get to where it is? But they're making the assumption, and we gave them the assumption, that we're not a mason industry. We are an access industry. So for us, as an access industry, we're drilling the holes to put up the equipment that gets them to the part of the facade where they're going to do the masonry work. We're not doing the masonry work in that respect. So dealing with it as an access problem, then we've got two things to consider. We use the equipment that's been put into the OSHA leaflet, the vacuuming systems that they have indicated are sufficient for this type of infrequent work. And secondly, we control any ancillary dust that would land on either a plank or on a board in that process by the use of water to control and contain it. Now, I think it's fair to say, and this is why the Masonry Contractors Association are really fighting against the silica rule at the moment and are working really hard in Washington with senators and with lobbying groups, is that the second part of that issue, which is what work are you going to be doing from the scaffold or the mast climber, and what dust does it produce, and how do you control and minimize the effects of that, is a much bigger question. And at the moment, I think it's fair to say that as the access industry, scaffolding and access industry that we are, the erecting and dismantling of the equipment that we use, we have a solution for. I think the control of any minimal dust that's created from that process that may land on a machine or land on a plank or a scaffold board is probably able to be controlled by water. In fact, that was the suggestion that OSHA gave to me when I talked to them about it. But if you're a mason, then I think there's more of a responsibility. And the Mason Contractors Association, in recognition of that, even though they are fighting the rule itself, have set up silica training programs from the MCAA to bring in and to train people to be qualified, to be able to determine exposure levels and control measures. Okay? So if we have an access, if we're an access company and that's all we do, we have our solution, I think, and it seems to be acceptable to OSHA from the discussions that I've had with them. It needs to be written down. It needs to be in a control plan. It may be the same control plan for every job that you do, but it needs to be in a control plan. And it needs to talk about exposure. It needs to talk about the fact that Table 1 gives the advice. It needs to be relatable back to the advice that OSHA has given. We also have to designate a competent person to implement the written exposure plan. Even if we say that Table 1 is using the right equipment and then controlling any excess dust with the use of water, we still have to make someone responsible, give them a work method, and give them some method of controls. So whether what we're doing is minimally creating crystallized silica dust or not, we still have to write something down. We have to have a plan. That plan needs to find its way to a qualified person, and it also has to get to the job site and find its way into training on the job site itself for our erectors and our dismantlers in particular. And also restrict housekeeping practices that expose workers to silica, such as the use of compressed air without a ventilation system to capture the dust and dry sweeping. Where effective, safe alternatives are available. So basically, as an industry, we have controls. As soon as you step out into another environment, and this is where the qualified area comes into this, as an employer has to recognize when we are stepping out of that box and into an area that we are unable to quantify. The minute that we do that, we then have to put together a new plan with a qualified person, and the process begins again. But at that point, we don't necessarily have the information and the advice in Table 1 to lean on anymore. So when we're putting up the scaffold, the mast climbers, and the transport platforms, adhere, I think, to Table 1. That's certainly going to be my policy. Adhere to Table 1, control any excess dust, which should be minimal within that process with the use of water. And if we step outside of that box, make sure that someone understands that at that point we have to stop and reevaluate by using some kind of qualified person. That qualified person may need to go through some extra training at that point, or obviously before we get to that stage. So at the moment, that's kind of the best advice that OSHA gave me. And I think for us, in what we do on a daily basis, it's probably okay. I think the masonry industry has a much more substantial problem to deal with. And there's some really fervent training going on right now within the masonry industry to get qualified people out there onto job sites to handle what, for them, may well be a different process every day or every week. And that's much more of a significant problem. Employers covered by the standard, and this is something that most people don't read, are required to offer medical exams, including chest x-rays and lung function tests, every 3 years for workers who are required by the standard to wear a respirator for 30 or more days per year. Well, again, if we follow Table 1, we would seem that's out with the realm of our area of operation right now. To train workers on the health effects of silica exposure, workplace tasks that can expose them to silica, and ways to limit exposure. That's something that we must do. I don't think anyone in this room could sit back and say that none of the workers that they have might not to be in possession of that information before they take on a job. And to keep records of workers' silica exposure and medical exams. So again, this comes down to the 30 days or more per year. This exposure level that we don't have currently, as long as we manage it properly, then we have slightly less to do within those 3 bullet points than maybe the masons industry would have to do. But we certainly have to take a responsible attitude to it. We have to make sure we stick to Table 1. We have to make sure we clean up excess dust. And the minute it becomes something that falls out with our general control and our general method and our general training that we've given to our personnel, someone has to recognize that, step back, and reassess it. Last, and this is by way of an update on something that we've been working on in the industry. As many of you know, the crane arms on the mast climbing work platforms were originally covered by the crane regulations, 2010 crane regulations, where this equipment was defined by OSHA or by the OSHA definition as a crane. And I was able to tell you last year, in fact, I wasn't able to tell you. I was going through my American citizenship and I didn't get to Montreal, but I think Ted did the presentation and explained that I-beam type hoists, like this unit here, were exonerated from under the auspices of the crane standard last year. The reason for that is not because they think that we're really special and they want to help us, right? The reason is that if you've ever been on the highway and you see those trucks with the I-beams sticking out the back that lift pieces of precast or marble or stone out of the back of the truck, that industry's got a lot more power than we have. And they were the ones who did all the lobbying work and put all the pressure on. And in the middle of that, this type of equipment here became exonerated because it's based on the I-beam omnidirectional system. So we still had a problem to solve, and the problem that we had to solve is that this type of equipment here, rather than just running in and out on the I-beam, has the ability to move left and right. And OSHA did not remove that type of material lift on a mast climber, did not remove that from under the auspices of the crane regulations in their ruling of July last year. So as an industry, we've been working to do something about that if we can. Myself, Ted Bevel, Jay Gordon, Francois Villeneuve, people in the industry who have interest in this, decided to take advantage of the public comment period, which is now closed, but we had like a 15, 20-day window, and we encouraged the industry to write to OSHA through regulations.gov in the public comment period that we had on this, before operator certification comes in November of this year. And we had the opportunity as an industry to weigh in on this subject. And so we crafted some letters for our members to send to OSHA through regulations.gov. I know that when I went on to regulations.gov, I certainly counted more than 50 letters from customers or employees of our companies who we encouraged to write in using these standard format letters. And as I checked it, it was still about 3 or 4 days to go to the closing period. But Francois, I know you monitored it too. I think we were maybe closer to the 70 or 80 at least, rather than the 50. So what OSHA has now from us as an industry is a deluge of letters, not complaining, but offering valid reasons why this equipment should not be covered under the crane regulations, and pointing to the fact that we should look for this product, this type of crane arm, to be removed from under the auspices of the crane regulations. The public comment is closed. OSHA now has gone to consider all of this. The next step will be to figure out and to hear from them, I guess, what their decision is or what their thought process is. Hopefully we'll get an early warning sign from that, and that will give us the chance to see what's going on, to maybe do something more about it, or at least to understand where the ruling is going, so that we can prepare members, if we have to, for the decision that they're going to make. But at the moment, we mobilized pretty quickly. We did a hell of a lot of work in a short period of time. And I'd like to thank the people who were involved in that, like Jay, Ted, Francois. Everybody got involved, and we gave it the best chance, I think, that we could, to make sure that OSHA hears from us that we don't want to be in a situation where we cannot use this type of equipment because we cannot qualify people to use it. And that was what the end result was going to be, or will be, in November. So that's all I've really got to talk about today. As far as the silica rule is concerned, I've been working with, and Ted knows this, I've been working on a method statement for the use of this type of equipment, for the drilling that goes on and the erecting, dismantling of mass climbing work platforms and transport platforms. That method statement, the written work process that's required by OSHA, if anyone in this room wants to avail themselves of any of that, then happy to share that with anybody. But please, we have to make sure that even if the silica exposure is contained within Table 1, there's still certain things that we have to do. And so we want to be able to give everyone the support that we can to make sure that they are compliant. And so a plan, a safe working plan, the establishment of a qualified person, this kind of information is stuff that we as an industry can make available so that it will make it as easy for you to comply as possible. Okay? Any questions?
Not so much a question, just a bit of information. You mentioned the pamphlet, and OSHA makes or produces a small entity compliance guide, which is extremely helpful in putting together a program. Page 4.
Just give it, if you don't mind, just repeat that, because
If I will. Sure.
I know what you're talking about, and I'd like them to
Yeah.
hear this.
The document is called the OSHA Small Entity Compliance Guide. And so it's pulled the rules and made it in clear, plain English. Page 4 is particularly interesting because it's one paragraph that says, if the worker is exposed for less than 15 minutes per shift, then you need to do nothing.
Yep.
And that includes dust collection.
Yeah.
And as part of our plan, we've adopted an exposure of less than 10 minutes. The average scaffold builder sinks 3 to 5 anchors a day if they're
Sure.
really moving. And so if they limit themselves to less than 10 minutes, which is 5 minutes under the maximum exposure, you can effectively, for that particular application,
Yes.
not have to do anything. Early on, we were trying to implement as fast as we could, and we made a statement to the workers, if you feel you'd like to wear a dust mask, that's okay. And when my local OSHA liaison looked at that, he said, you don't want to do that.
Yeah.
If you recommend to your workers that they can wear a dust mask, you then have to have them fit tested, even for a paper dust mask.
Correct.
So in your language, OSHA does not require a dust mask, but if you choose to wear a dust mask on your own, be sure to follow the manufacturer's instructions.
Yes. Yeah. That's a very important point. Right? I talked about, in the presentation here, I talked about this need or desire not to get involved in the fit testing process, and it's very important. It's something that we'd like not to get into. The other thing I would say about the initial piece, and you're quite right, if there's a minimum exposure below X number of minutes, you can say, you know, no exposure, no relevant exposure. Don't get rose-tinted glasses and put them on when you're trying to assess your 10 minutes or your 15 minutes, yeah? Don't have somebody, that was only 7, right? In other words, be realistic about that assessment. Because if it comes to a situation where you're going to be assessed, the person who's going to assess you is not going to be wearing the same rose-tinted spectacles that you wore, you know? And so it's very important that, it's very important that it's realistic. That assessment has to be done, not scientifically, but it has to be, the way that you described that process is the way you have to do it. But just be realistic about the time factor. Because you know they're going to sit in their car outside the job site and look in through the fence, and they're going to measure how long it takes your guys to drill holes, yeah? They do it with everything else, so, you know, let's not expect that they're going to change their habits at this point. So, absolutely critical that you're realistic about that process. Okay? Okay, guys? Up. Microphone. Just grab the microphone.
I'm still learning about silica. At first, of course.
That's a very good point.
Yeah. I was worried. We're putting scaffold up in a tank and they're sandblasting and we're taking out, the guys are coming out black with sand.
Yep.
And then I was told that's not the silica, that's the issue.
Yeah.
So I'd like to know if there are any other materials other than concrete that we need to worry about. Because I understand drywallers are also fighting the silica standard.
They are, and this is where the work method and the qualified person is an important part of this, right? You know, I can only give you an example. Like in previous years, and we just had a presentation about shoring, right? Okay, and if I'm in the mast climber business and I'm going to put shore posts underneath a mast climber down 3 levels of car park to grade, right? I'm going to collect pieces of paper, right? I'm going to pull together the information on the car park. I'm going to pull together the information on the shore post. I'm going to check the shore post factor of safety, because usually they're 3 to 1 and a scaffold is 4 to 1, so now you've got to put an extra shore, right? All of this stuff, we kind of know how we do all that, right? And we put it all in a file and we never visit it again, right? It's like when you buy fruit at the supermarket, right? You buy it with the best of intentions and then 2 weeks later you throw it out because you never went back to the fruit bowl, right? You've been eating chocolate all the way through, right? And it's kind of the same thing with this, right? You have to do your due diligence, you know? If every day that you're drilling into a concrete building, a 3,500 PSI, 5,000 PSI building, and you're drilling 5-8 holes, and you're drilling 5 or 6 a day, or whatever you're doing, you have a work plan. If that work plan takes you below the level of exposure where you need to even think about vacuuming, right, then great. Right? But the minute that you change that and you look at another substance, okay, then, I mean, somebody at the back said, OSHA's still learning about this, right? I took the there's something called ACOSH up there, the Advisory Committee on Construction Safety and Health. All these wonderful, great and august people who I don't know have ever been on a job site, right? And they wanted to do a field trip, and I took them to the National Museum of Art, or Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. for a field trip. I took them there because OSHA can't afford to give them any money for travel, right? So we walked across 2 traffic crossings, and we got to the other side, and we gave them this overview of the job. Now, the material that was on that National Gallery of Art was being reworked, re-drilled, redressed, and hung back on the building. The facade is actually a national art treasure, not the building itself, just the facade. And this whole discussion happened on the job where the GC was talking about the job itself, and someone from ACOSH at the back said, "What do you do about silica?" Because this was where the discussions were kind of emanating on the silica. And the project manager said, "We don't produce silica in this process. There's no silica in that material," right? Which goes back to what you were saying. And so they had a rather kind of arguing, embarrassing moment. And I think what was going on was the GC was probably right, and the guy from ACOSH was maybe wrong, but in the middle of it, nobody really quite had a definite answer except the GC who had done the homework and said there's no silica there, right? But at that time, there was no silica rule. So, you know, they may have looked at it, but not in the detail that they'd have to look at it today. So when you go into a process like that, that's the first thing you're going to have to do is you're going to have to collect pieces of paper, right? Is there the possibility of crystallized silica being produced? If there is, then go to Table 1, you know? If Table 1 doesn't apply, then now we're into training and qualified person and quantification. So yes, there are environments that, the other one would be, for instance, if you're working in an elevator shaft, right? For me, that's a very different scenario if you're drilling holes in an elevator shaft to drilling something on a wall on a job site somewhere, right? You know, but there are also other considerations in an elevator shaft that you should have thought of before, right? If you're using a gas-powered machine, then you're obviously talking about fumes, right? You're talking about noise in an elevator shaft if you've got an engine running. So you should have already done some of the homework for some of these confined space situations. This would be another part to that, you know? But really, the first part you're going to have to do is due diligence. Figure out what 99% of your business is and get that right and stick it in a file and make sure it finds its way into training of the incumbents who need to be trained. And for the other 1%, 2%, 3%, whatever it is, make sure somebody's qualified, first of all, or competent with the authority to say, stop, this is something different, let's stop and reassess it, and then find somebody who's qualified to assess it and produce a work practice, a safe work practice and a solution, file it, and train them. I mean, it's basically, unfortunately, that's what you're going to have to do until you get to the point where you have a solution for each of the aspects of the job that you're going to perform over the years, you know. Anybody? Can I go to the bar now? Okay, thank you very much.